Anyway, I don't feel very good. I have a sore throat and I'm having just not very good. I managed to get through chapter 25. This chapter required a lot of work because a lot of stuff in there I didn't want. So I had to do pretty much a major rewrite today, and then reading it has proved to be very difficult because of my throat, my sore throat. Can't seem to, when you're sick, you can't breathe as effectively, efficiently, whatever. So anyway, I figured though I wanted to get this one read because I don't know what I'm going to be like tomorrow. This might be my last good day, if you want to call it good, for the next couple days. So I wanted to get this one read. So anyway, here it is, chapter 25. Song of Mornius, chapter 25. Avalar shook her head and lunged, cutting deep into the battle's heart. Her father's words echoed from her past, from their many practices along the beach. Strike true, daughter, without hesitation. Flex a beat at the wrist, now, at the moment of impact. Now again, Avalar, and again! She obeyed with her mind turned inward, her gaze on her father's face. With his voice in her ears she held steady, her hatred and fear set aside. Here was the one thing she had been born to do, to protect and do battle, to her death if necessary, to protect the vulnerable. All that mattered was the pulsing in her neck, the rhythmic crack of steel against bone. Avalar grunted as her arm grew numb. She fought with blood on her forehead, a hazy smear of it across her sight. Blades found her flesh, striking when she couldn't dodge fast enough or drag her sword around for more. She fought without thinking, fought in time to her heart's rhythm. In a half-crouch, she jumped forward, her blade slicing a cheek, cutting low and deep below scale-armored ribs. Fluids jetted across her chest. The Veelerman's eyes sprang open, even as his magic-warped legs folded him dead to the snow. As she leapt his body, an image flashed behind her eyes. A human in black, standing, staring, the slayer of Teardon. Avalar tensed as the battle became deafening. Shrieks of fury and pain mingled with the clamor of steel. Against the tide of living and dead, she turned toward a black-robed figure. He sneered as if he knew how her nerves yowled with sudden pain, how her last meal rose up to sour her throat. A flick of his wrist sent her stumbling backward. Gagging, she tripped on a corpse and fell. Avalar! She caught the red flash of Morriston's bear fur, heard his muffled cursing as he came up short. A knot of flightless Veelermen cut him off, shoved him back, swords hammered at his head. The black robe advanced, his fists clenched, his midnight eyes bright with power, magic warped beyond repair. With a hint of a gesture, he fractured her vision, turned her sight into splinters, mere glimpses of forest and sky. His magic was her own, drained from her flesh to give him his power. Avalar groaned. Her bones ached as if they threatened to burst. Trembling violently, she rolled to her knees. Pressure mounted in her chest, welled in her throat. Her mouth gaped open. Blood burst from her lips as she struggled for air. "You think your slavers were powerful?" the mage snarled beside her head. He bared his teeth as he spoke, drawing back his pale lips. "Think again, giant. I am Methenmen's, Malian's head priest, and Teardon's slayer. Your slavers were nothing compared to me." Avalar nodded, ears ringing. Deep in her chest she heard a cracking sound. It was her magic being pulled from her body. Her ribs popped as internal pressures began to force them apart. She was in agony, writhing, helpless. Moaning, she tossed her head. Blood from her mouth sprayed across the snow. "My prey!" The cry was broken, piercing. From one blink to the next came a flash of tawny fur, the blur of a lean, dappled body in flight. With a vicious snarl, the prowler sprang at the mage and drove him down. Avalar struggled to see, to identify the sudden surge of power, the healthy thrum of old magic against her skin. The prowler crouched low, her jaws unhinging to fasten on her prey. Under her death bite, the human mage screamed. The world went midnight. The blackstone staff he carried in his hands exploded. The prowler flipped backward and flat, a smoldering tangle of melted limbs and charred fur. Across the hill, Tarek's shout sounded frantic. His men retreated, driven back by more of the creatures, winged Veelermen diving from the sky. Again Methenmens filled her sight, blood streaming down his neck. He raised his staff and touched it to her forehead. In agony she screamed as it burned her skin. "If you die," he said softly, "we win. How simple it would be, just one more giant." "Avalar!" It was Tarek's voice, so much like his brother's. Avalar jerked back her head. With an angry fist she slapped the staff away. She had tried to save Cameron and failed, had fought with all her strength across Tyrdawn's bloody square, but a lesser mage had stopped her, while this one... Methenmen smiled viciously, as if reading her thoughts. Glowering despite her weakness, Avalar pulled herself erect. With a grunt of effort she raised her heavy sword. Fearless, the mage stared up, his black eyes glinting. Over the hill she saw as Tarek stumbled, watched him slump to his knees in the snow. "So dies the fool, Tarek Florin," snarled the mage through his teeth. "Ah!" Blinded by fury, she brought her sword sweeping downward with all her strength, for Cameron and Tarek and her people long dead, to strike empty air. Dragged by the weight of her stroke, her body turned against her will, yet her gaze didn't waver from the place where the mage had been, should have been. Avalar whirled. Through the blur of her tears she watched the tide fall at last, the massive wave of flightless creatures surging across the hill. Tarek vanished from her view, the faces and swords of his men along with him. Too late, she thought in despair. Oh, Tarek! A groan reached her. Through a smear of silver grief, Avalar stumbled to its source, hunkering down beside the stricken prowler. Shetra's golden eyes stared back, her nose wrinkling as she coughed in pain. "Giant, well?" she asked weakly. She writhed where she lay, then dropped a questing paw to her ribs. "No." Avalar stayed the creature's wrist. It was better this way, she thought. Kinder for Shetra. From the ribs down the prowler was a burnt-out shell. Black liquid sizzled and popped, the warped magic dissolving the prowler's spine, the muscles and organs beneath the melted skin. Shetra's eyes widened as she sniffed. "Yeesh!" She paused. "Bad smell, she-prowler?" With a hard swallow, Avalar nodded. "You saved my life, beautiful one. This wound was meant for me." The prowler's lips twisted above her fangs. "Death! Good," she hissed. Avalar bent low to hear over the shouts and cries of the battle beyond the trees. "Yes," her voice broke. "You have saved." With her arms she scrubbed at the water on her face. "A giant. You saved me." "Prowler follow," Shetra whispered. "Protect." Avalar clenched Shetra's paw as breath wheezed past the prowler's black lips. Then Shetra went rigid, her spine arcing back. With a coughing sigh, she fell limp, her eyes focused on nothing. Avalar held her close, stroking her face. Any moment the tide would turn and Tarek's slayers would come for her, sitting remorseful and forgotten in the snow. "They think the mage slew me," she thought grimly. "Soon they will discover their mistake. I cannot hope to fight so many." A tingle of her senses turned her head. Through the dripping tangle of her hair she saw a slight figure stumble from the trees, felt the power he brought with him burn hot against her skin. Muscles bunched in her forearms as she settled the prowler's body. No, she thought fiercely. Her blood throbbed in her neck, rekindled and quickened to the point where she saw red. Here and now it would end. She would kill this monster, this mage who slew Tyrdan. Again she gripped her sword. Method mens. Now that she knew it, again and again her heart raged his name. Slayer! Silently she held herself crouched and rigid in the snow, watching as the humans stumbled toward the mob of creatures and the place of Tarek's fall. Her eyes caught a blue-white gleaming. She spotted the staff flaring in his hands, heard with her power-heightened senses his voice, weeping. Halram, come. Galen? Avalar whispered, the chill realization dousing at once the rage in her heart. From the trees a black wedge of creatures swarmed at her, as beyond their heads others dove at him. They had him, she realized, flailing wildly with her sword. In their mindless grasp she saw him conscious, yet unresisting, flopping limply as they tossed him back and forth. He's given up, she realized, abandoned us. The sword in her hands grew impossibly heavy. Blinded by tears, she leaned trembling over her weapon, panting hoarsely for air. She was past caring, utterly oblivious to how much the claws and blades of the enemy tore at her. She had failed Cameron and Tarek. She had failed her people, and now Galen too. A crashing like thunder silenced her thoughts. Flinching, she cowered down under the painful weight of her attackers. Then the ground heaved beneath her knees. A great spray of powdery snow slapped her across the face. White fire rushed at her through hissing gouts of hot steam. In reflex, she dropped her sword and threw up her arms. And yet... She paused. Somehow the fire went by without touching her. In a slow kind of amazement, she stared through a hazy cushion of crackling air as the creatures around her went down under the blast, tumbling away helplessly, their wings and tails thrashing. Another splintering roar, its pitch climbing until Avalar covered her ears and howled. Outside her shield of protective air, she watched how the creatures she fought still moved. They were not melting or dying or being consumed. Instead, they gathered together, entwined themselves into protective balls of wings and tails, their keening scarcely audible. Avalar stared through the sheets of white power, a hurricane of might just as fierce as the pulsing of a sun. Through the glare, she saw a figure. The staff pulsed hot on the ground where it lay, barely visible, but at the core of the blasts, the raging heart of the unending inferno, one human stood alone. Galen Laval. Huddling over her knees, Avalar strained to see his face as tirelessly his power blasted, stripping the land of snow and ice, of death and violence and blood. Then movement from the side snagged her vision. She turned her head. Dumbfounded, she stared at the bodies between the trees. The creatures were untangling themselves from each other and the underbrush, wings and tails absorbed into their flesh. Their scaly armor softened back to skin, the deadly protruding spines of their vertebrae sinking down. They were humans, not the enemy, their bodies becoming whole and healthy, some with faces she remembered from Tyrdan. Lowering her chin, Avalar's gaze settled on the crumpled body of the prowler. Only now Shetra was moving again, curling herself into a tight ball. As Avalar watched in amazement, she batted at the fire blasting around her with a tentative paw. The world stopped its trembling. Avalar held her breath as the glare across the soggy ground faded. She heard a wet squelching sound as humans went walking by, their naked bodies shivering hard, steaming in the cold air that at once replaced the fire. All around her she heard cries of stunned surprise, the excited clamor of many voices talking at once. Galen? The voice was familiar. Avalar stiffened, then blinked, looking up. Across the slushy ground stood Tarek, bending over his friend. Beside him, Galen sat unblinking in the mud, his legs turned sharply sideways, like he had no idea what to do with them. "Can you help these people?" Tarek was asking him softly, and getting no response. Avalar, climbing to her feet, saw no sign of blood on Tarek, or of wounds anywhere, she realized, looking around. On anyone. "Galen?" Tarek first clasped his arm above the elbow, then shook him. "Galen!" He stepped back. Avalar, watching him, saw him pull himself together, take command of himself once more. "Roth!" His voice rapped out. "The Eris village isn't far, right south and west of the trail we came down on. They live at the foot of Mount Allianth. There." He pointed. "You should see their fires once you're across the field. Tell them we need blankets and clothing, or food, anything they can spare." As Roth nodded and turned toward the horses, Tarek caught her watching and hurried over. "Avalar," he said with a nod, "are you harmed?" All that magic. With his hazel eyes he studied her closely. "You're not harmed?" She shook her head as Roth, riding bareback on his tall gray charger, galloped by them both with a splashing of slushy mud. "Good," said Tarek. He paused, then nodded to Shetra. "What about—" "She's a prowler, I see. Is she a danger?" He shook his head at Shetra's toothy smile. "Oh, never mind. Avalar, if she can help, great. Put her to work. Otherwise, right now I need you. These people are from Tirdan, some of them. They need our help now. Find Virgan." "Morriston!" He gestured as the big man stomped into view. "Good man. Get a crew and get the tents situated. I want them packed with these people, Lieutenant. Quick, before they freeze." Avalar met Shetra's gaze as Tarek stumbled back to Galen. Shetra huffed between her teeth, whiskers flaring to taste the wind. "Him leader?" "Yes, beautiful one." Avalar nodded. Tarek was pulling at Galen's shoulders, positioning him at the base of a tree where its trunk could support his spine. Then he lifted Galen's legs, first one and then the other, straightening them as best he could. Shetra followed her gaze and huffed again, flicking her long red tail. "Him sick?" "I don't know." Avalar frowned. She found herself striding toward the tent she shared with Morriston. At its entrance, she crouched on her heels and reached in. Blindly she groped under the tent's low roof with her fingers, then grasped a handful of thick fur. It was her Sunderkhan parka, more for travel than wearing around in the sunlit camp, but now she carried it to where Tarek knelt and squatted beside him, next to Galen. Without a word she went to work, tucking its warm folds over and behind Galen Laval, and then forward to cover his legs. "I don't understand," Tarek told her softly. "He doesn't respond." Avalar shifted to her knees. For a long moment she regarded the young man who was her friend, searching his face, the unblinking brown eyes staring blankly past her. "Maybe it was too much," said Tarek. "He didn't just kill them this time, Giant. He healed them." She nodded slowly. Reaching out, she caught Galen's chin and lifted his head, forcing his eyes into the light where she could see them. Sudden tears blurred her sight, smearing from her vision her friend's lifeless stare. "Sails," she whispered at the ache in her throat. Turning away, she pressed hard against Tarek, huddled over him with her forehead to his shoulder until he pushed himself back and gripped her face. "What is it?" Tarek demanded, his worried frown filling her sight, his voice both urgent and gentle. "Giant, what did you see?" "Nothing." Her voice flailed in her throat like a wounded bird. Avalar closed her eyes, tears warming her face. Helplessly she gestured toward Galen. "Gone," she whispered brokenly. "Tarek, he's gone." "No." The booming voice startled them both. Galen's voice, from his mouth, yet not his own. Tarek, meeting her eyes, took hold of Galen's shoulders. "What?" he demanded. "Talk to me, Galen. Who are you?" "I am the song," came Galen's changed voice. "The singer remains here within my grasp, but I am the song of the singer and the song of the staff. I am the song of Mornius."